The Black Forest Disciplinary School. In a remote stretch of Pennsylvania woodland, a shuttered brick building rots beneath the canopy of the Black Forest region. Locals refer to it only in hushed tones, if at all. From 1952 to 1973, it was home to the Black Forest Disciplinary School, a correctional academy for troubled youth operated under private contract with the state. Over 2 decades, 191 students entered its gates and were never seen again. Their disappearances were recorded individually, almost ritualistically, buried in bureaucratic memos, never investigated as a collective horror. Official responses dismissed them as runaways, but interviews, archived letters, and leaked disciplinary logs tell a different story. One of silence, complicit law enforcement, and a system designed to forget its children. To the public, Black Forest Disciplinary School was a last resort facility for unmanageable boys between the ages of 9 and 17. Promotional material described a rigorous but fair institution focused on discipline, hard work, and spiritual reform. It boasted strict schedules, mandatory labor, and nightly scripture study. Administrators claimed to have reformed over 2,000 boys by the time the school closed. Yet whispers from former employees paint a darker image: solitary confinement, disguised as reflection time, forced labor passed off as vocational training, and severe corporal punishment thinly veiled as moral correction. Parents received handwritten updates, always upbeat, often generic. Visits were heavily restricted. After the 4th disappearance in 1954, state authorities conducted a brief inspection, resulting in no action. By the time the school quietly shuttered in 1973, 191 children had vanished. The official count remains 0. The Black Forest region of north-central Pennsylvania, stretching across Clinton and Lycoming counties, was once dominated by logging camps, shale quarries, and isolation. In 1952, a quiet land transfer occurred. 87 acres of former timber company land were sold to a private educational trust incorporated under the name Dominion Reformatory Institute. That name was never used again. The facility would market itself as the Black Forest Disciplinary School, a name chosen perhaps cynically to evoke an image of medieval severity. At its dedication ceremony in September 1952, 3 local politicians, 1 Catholic bishop, and a minor state education official appeared. The press photos captured a modest brick compound, whitewashed and clean, surrounded by low fencing and forest. Inside, however, construction had been rushed. Former maintenance worker Gerald Leames, later interviewed under subpoena in 1976, testified that plumbing wasn't finished until 6 weeks after opening. Heating pipes burst that first winter. But the school accepted its first 17 boys by October anyway. All were wards of the state, transferred from juvenile detention centers or forcibly removed from foster homes under behavioral clauses. From the start, the school's philosophy skewed toward what one 1953 internal report called punitive redemption. This was not a place of learning. It operated more like a low-security prison with religious ornamentation. Mornings began at 5:30 a.m. with freezing outdoor drills. Breakfasts were intentionally bland: cornmeal, weak coffee substitute, unbuttered toast. Lessons consisted of rote memorization of biblical passages and the repetition of penance phrases, sometimes for hours. Physical labor was central. Students were expected to clear forest brush, dig latrines, pour cement, and haul wood. These tasks were labeled character exercises. Each wing of the building was monitored by 2 staff members, referred to only by title: superintendent, warden, overseer. No staff photos were ever released. Most were recruited from within the church, retired military, or had prior employment in correctional environments. They rarely left campus, lived in on-site quarters, and used coded names in official records: Overseer L, Warden J, Chaplain G. By design, there were no personal identifiers. The turnover rate was high, but exit interviews were sealed. For local townspeople, the school was a source of mystery and economic friction. While it employed around 30 full-time staff, they were never hired from nearby communities. Local tradesmen were denied access to the grounds unless accompanied. Road access was intentionally limited. A single gravel path, labelled Route 9 Extension, was not included in county maintenance logs. Maps omitted the facility altogether, showing instead a shaded state research parcel. Rumours started as early as 1953. A boy from Wilkes-Barre named Edwin Carl Ryson was dropped off by county deputies in December and was never heard from again. His case file was misfiled under Returned to Family, though no relatives reported receiving him. A year later, two more boys, Jesse Willoughby and Manuel Ortiz, were recorded as having fled the premises. State police conducted no searches. A brief note in the 1955 Lycoming County year-end judicial report stated, "The Black Forest Disciplinary School maintains strict internal protocols and has resolved its minor custody issues." By 1956, the school's internal structure became more militarized. A new wing was added, Wing E. The designation itself was opaque. There had never been Wings A through D. Wing E was built below ground, accessible through a hatch in the chapel's floor. It was explained to inspectors as a storm shelter. In truth, it was solitary. 4 cells, no windows, an intercom system wired to the overseer's quarters. Former student Lawrence Dembski, one of the rare documented survivors, described being placed in Wing E for mouth offenses, i.e., questioning scripture. He was left in darkness for 9 days. The only water came from a capped pipe in the wall, activated externally. Lawrence's report was dismissed as delusional. He had spent the next decade in and out of psychiatric wards, diagnosed with dissociative tendencies. But 2 decades later, when Wing E was exhumed during the 1977 grand jury investigation, its dimensions matched his drawings. By the late 1950s, the school's funding had grown disproportionately to its reported enrollment. State budget ledgers show that Black Forest Disciplinary School was receiving annual increases of up to 12%, despite keeping enrollment below capacity. The justification offered in appropriations hearings was always the same: specialized care. In practice, no audits were conducted. The facility was classified as a hybrid under Pennsylvania's Youth Correctional Partnership Program, a designation that exempted it from standard oversight applied to public schools or jails. No ombudsman, no parent liaison, no public board. Letters home were screened. Each student was allowed 1 per month written under supervision and pre-approved before mailing. Any mention of injury, fear, or request for removal was flagged and destroyed. Staff would then write alternate letters in the students' names. These were mailed from a nearby town to avoid postmark scrutiny. Surviving parents described the letters as oddly generic, with many repeating phrases from religious brochures. Phrases like, "I am grateful for this redemptive journey," or "God is correcting my path," appeared with unsettling frequency. The handwriting often did not match known samples. The school also imposed restrictions on visitation. Official policy limited visits to once every 6 months, and even then only with 7 days advance approval. Records reveal that fewer than 1 in 10 families successfully arranged a visit. Many were told their requests had been received too late, or that the student was in reflection phase, a euphemism for punishment that rendered visits impossible. In several cases, parents were informed weeks later that their child had absconded, shortly before the scheduled visit. The phrase appeared in all reports identically, suggesting a form letter. Beginning in 1958, a second chapel was added to the grounds. This new building was not registered in county records. The construction was completed by students using quarried stone and timber from the surrounding forest. No contractors were hired. The chapel was octagonal, windowless, and partially underground. Former staff notes later obtained during litigation refer to it cryptically as the testimonial chamber. No services were ever recorded there. Its true purpose remains unknown, though survivors recalled being summoned to its entrance after infractions. One boy, whose initials appear in a rare 1961 disciplinary log, was cited for blasphemous resistance and ordered to 3 days of testimonial silence. He was not seen afterward. The school's internal justice system was modeled after military court-martial structures. There were no appeals. Punishments included cold showers, food deprivation, forced kneeling on gravel for hours, and prolonged isolation. The worst punishment, known among the boys as deep schooling, involved being taken from the dormitory at night and returned days later, visibly changed. Witnesses reported hair cut unevenly, hands scraped raw, eyes unfocused. One boy, Jacob Denner, returned from deep schooling with his left hand in a makeshift cast. No medical explanation was ever given. He vanished 3 weeks later. Staff claimed he left during latrine duty. Between 1952 and 1960, the school filed 37 voluntary closure reports with the county registrar. These reports stated that individual students had either aged out or completed their term under special provision. However, nearly half of those named were under 14 years old. Under Pennsylvania law at the time, no student under 15 could legally be released from a disciplinary program without a parent or guardian's signed retrieval. No such retrievals were documented. In effect, these children were erased. Suspicion might have grown earlier had it not been for the complete lack of survivors willing to testify. Of the estimated 2,000 boys processed through the school in 21 years, fewer than 140 have been located. Most refused interviews or gave inconsistent accounts. Many were unreachable, incarcerated, or institutionalized. The school created not only a physical containment system, but a psychological one. Students were taught to distrust outsiders, fear police, and believe that their families had abandoned them. For some, that was true. Parental signatures on intake forms often included forged consent. Investigators later confirmed that at least 16 boys were admitted with no known guardian at all. In 1962, the school received a quiet commendation from the State Correctional Commission. The commendation, unearthed in 1991, praised discipline innovation and exemplary containment procedures. It was signed by 3 commissioners, one of whom would later join the board of a private juvenile detention contractor in Ohio. The language in the document reveals the state's broader agenda: reduction of urban juvenile detentions by outsourcing to rural facilities. Black Forest fit that mold perfectly. Isolated, self-sustaining, off-book. There were brief moments when the facade cracked. In 1964, a shipment of student uniforms ordered from a Pittsburgh textile vendor arrived one size short. The company attempted to reach the school for clarification, but received no reply. Weeks later, they contacted the state procurement liaison, who sent an investigator. That investigator, a low-level logistics officer named Harold R. Fisk, filed a 3-page memo noting that the school grounds were disturbingly silent during his visit, and that staff appeared unusually evasive regarding roster counts. His memo was redacted in later archives, and Fisk was reassigned. He died in 1966, officially of heart failure, though colleagues later claimed he was under immense stress. Around this same time, internal policies began referring to vaporizations. The term appeared in handwritten margins of transfer logs and coded notes from overseers. While no definition was ever provided, its context suggested terminal outcomes. One log entry from December 1965 reads, "Subject 00815 did not respond to staged retrieval. Approved for vaporization. No witness assigned." Subject 00815 was a boy named Keegan Harlow, age 13, placed at the school under court order for petty theft. His mother received a final letter in February stating that Keegan had relocated under a vocational apprenticeship program. No such program existed. In 1967, a local hunter reported a disturbing sight near the school's perimeter fence. He claimed to see a line of boys digging what he described as a deep rectangular trench under supervision. When he approached, he was intercepted by 2 staffers in uniform and told he had crossed into private property. He later reported the incident to a township constable, but was discouraged from filing anything formal. No investigation was launched. By the time the final disappearance occurred in July 1973, the school had been flagged internally at the state level at least 4 times. Each flag was marked, "No action." The last student recorded was Raymond Ells, age 11. His intake form was never completed. His name appeared on no official roster, but his clothing was found during a post-closure inventory labeled RE in black marker. His bunk was made. His boots were damp. He was the 191st. The state had warnings. Some arrived on yellowing paper. Others whispered in back rooms by men unwilling to sign their names. In 1959, a social worker named Evelyn Lott filed a quiet complaint after a scheduled wellness review at Black Forest Disciplinary School was denied 3 times. She had been assigned to confirm the condition of a boy named Thomas Ray Sloan, aged 10, who had entered the facility 2 months prior under emergency protective custody. His aunt, who had taken guardianship after his parents' deaths, claimed she was never informed of his transfer. Evelyn, a junior social liaison at the time, requested access under statute. She was denied each time with vague reasoning: student unavailable, unit on lockdown, and finally lost in transfer. Her formal complaint, buried in the Department of Human Services files, noted that the Black Forest institution demonstrates obstructive behavior inconsistent with juvenile rights policy. The complaint was dismissed within a week. No follow-up was ever conducted. Thomas Sloan was never located. The aunt died in 1972, still requesting updates. There were other letters, all ignored. In March of 1961, a county school administrator from Harrisburg attempted to verify the educational records of a student, Bernard Latham, whose enrollment had abruptly ended mid-semester following a court disposition for vandalism. His paperwork showed transfer to a spiritual reform academy in Clinton County. When the administrator contacted Black Forest, he received no reply. A second letter was returned unopened. After 3 weeks, he sent a representative, a retired principal named Claiborne Myers, to inquire in person. According to a private diary found decades later among Myers' effects, he never made it past the front gate. The entry read simply, "Heavy gate. Young man in uniform. Not invited in. No voices from inside. Silence like a wall." Myers never followed up. In 1963, during a state-led census of juvenile facilities, Black Forest submitted falsified dormitory records listing 48 enrolled students, all assigned initials and code numbers. No birth dates, no medical notations, no departure history. The submission was accepted without audit. The official in charge of collating that data, Dennis R. Greaves, resigned quietly in 1965 amid unrelated fraud allegations. He was never asked about Black Forest during his investigation. Even more revealing were the entries buried in the maintenance invoices submitted to the state's Division of Institutional Facilities. Between 1965 and 1972, the school filed recurring work orders citing containment wall shifts, in-ground thermal collapse, and liquid seepage from Zone D. No such zones appeared on public-facing maps. When an external inspection crew from Latrobe Concrete was hired to evaluate foundation integrity in 1968, their access was limited to 2 above-ground buildings and a storage annex. They were escorted throughout the visit and later reported unexplained heat emissions near the north perimeter. The report was stamped confidential and retained in the Commission's off-record annex. It was not released until 1994, under litigation. A different kind of warning arrived in the form of 2 boys in 1966. They had escaped. Their names were Marcus Velt and Jeremy Boone, ages 12 and 13, respectively. They emerged from the forest 13 miles east of the facility, bruised, soaked, and nearly incoherent. A local couple found them wandering along a feeder road near Pine Creek. At first, police assumed it was a hoax or an exaggeration. The boys spoke in clipped phrases, repeating, "We weren't students and they burned the names." Hospital staff treated them for exposure and malnourishment. When interviewed formally, their statements were described as delusional. They referred to underground punishment areas, forced labor, and unnamed staff who didn't have real eyes. Marcus was eventually returned to state custody and placed in a psychiatric facility near Erie. Jeremy was moved into foster care, where he refused to speak for over a year. When later questioned during a lawsuit, his guardian claimed he would wake in the night whispering, "The tunnel keeps pulling." Neither boy was believed. No charges were filed. Both names were later removed from official state custody logs with the annotation, "Placement error." One former staff member, a nurse's aide named Carol Lissman, attempted to report irregularities to the state in 1969. She had worked at Black Forest for just under 7 months before resigning abruptly. In a letter addressed to the Department of Welfare, she wrote, "There are no medicine logs, injuries are not recorded, children go missing and no one looks." She included no names but detailed the layout of the lower level, including areas not listed on architectural diagrams. Her letter was never answered. Years later, when reached by a private investigator, she claimed her car had been tampered with twice in the month after she mailed the letter. On one occasion, her brakes failed while exiting a turn near Route 44. She moved to Ohio in 1970 and refused all further interviews. The most damning internal warning came not from a whistleblower, but from a misplaced requisition form. In 1970, a bulk request for 39 canvas restraint sacks, size child small, was filed with the state's medical supply contractor. The request originated from the school's coded supply chain ID and bore the signature of Overseer D. The contractor flagged the order due to its volume and category designation: restrictive physical compliance. It was sent to the state's Juvenile Procurement Oversight Office, which opened an inquiry. Within 2 weeks, the file was closed with the note, "Verified under spiritual guidance exemption." No further action was taken. These patterns, misdirected letters, redacted field reports, vanishing children marked as errors, should have drawn scrutiny. But the structure of bureaucratic neglect held. Reports were siloed, jurisdictions blurred. Each discrepancy looked isolated when viewed alone. No one at the time connected the totality. There was no system designed to capture silence. The parents who persisted faced obfuscation. Della Hoke, whose son Patrick was taken in 1967, traveled to the school in person after her letters were ignored for months. She was not allowed past the main office. She later testified that a man in a grey uniform told her, "Your boy has found redemption. We don't disturb redemption here." Patrick's final letter, dated 1 week before her visit, bore a signature she didn't recognize and mentioned receiving baptism by stillness. She was never given confirmation of his status. Patrick's records list him as discharged in 1969. No address, no follow-up. There were others, too many for coincidence, but no critical mass ever formed. No protest gathered outside the gates. No media campaigns emerged. The disappearances were always coded, delayed, rerouted. The pain of the families was spread thin across counties and years. Each case diluted the next. Even as late as 1972, with mounting discrepancies, internal memos continued to praise Black Forest's operational containment and minimized recidivism. Behind the numbers was a deliberate blindness, cultivated by a system more interested in closure rates than children. The gaps in the state's monitoring apparatus were not random. They were systemic, reinforced by procedural shields that rewarded compliance and penalized interference. Black Forest Disciplinary School exploited these structures with precision. Its administrators understood that silence, when bureaucratically justified, could outlast any isolated cry for help. In 1971, a clerk at the Bureau of Youth Oversight named Russell Brame filed a request to review the school's annual incident reports. He had been compiling comparative data on juvenile recidivism and noticed an absence of entries from Black Forest across multiple years. All other facilities had submitted the standard quarterly logs. Brame sent 2 follow-up letters. He received a brief reply typed on unheaded paper, "Reports not applicable under program-specific containment." Confused by the phrasing, he consulted with his supervisor, who instructed him to drop the matter. 3 weeks later, Brame's name was quietly removed from the interdepartmental roster. He was reassigned to document storage. His career stalled. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "There are doors I wish I hadn't knocked on." One of the few direct inspections conducted during the school's operation came in April 1972. A state-appointed auditor named Janet Wire arrived unannounced, intending to verify budget line items related to vocational training. She was met at the gate by a man who identified himself only as the chaplain. She was escorted through the administration building and shown carefully prepared exhibits: hand-carved furniture, grain ledgers, a greenhouse with labeled produce. Students were absent. When asked why, the chaplain explained that they were in moral instruction. Wire left a written note in her log. Facility presents as too rehearsed, no spontaneous elements, possibly staged. Upon returning to Harrisburg, she submitted a request to revisit with a second inspector. The request was denied. Her report was sealed with the note, satisfactory upon visual confirmation. That same month, a rural mail carrier named Everett Tulling submitted a complaint to his supervisor. For over 4 years, he had delivered sealed crates addressed from the school to a private address in St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. The recipient was never listed by name, only as Brother H. The crates bore a recurring inventory code, PF03. Tulling had been instructed not to question the contents, but during a storm-delayed drop-off, one of the wooden slats broke loose. Inside, he saw what he later described as coils of stained cloth and 2 wire-bound notebooks. He did not open the notebooks. He never heard back from his supervisor regarding the complaint. The deliveries continued until the school's closure. There was no organized protest from within the staff. Most had signed confidentiality waivers upon hiring. Others were selected specifically for their compliance backgrounds. A pattern emerged in recruitment files: former orderlies from shuttered mental institutions, low-ranking officers discharged from military service, and applicants rejected from seminary programs for undisclosed reasons. They were placed through temporary contracts with a private staffing firm based in Pittsburgh. The firm, Substantia Custodial Services, dissolved in 1974. No employment rosters survive. The school's final year saw increasing instability. Winter storms had damaged the perimeter fencing. Several reports indicated vermin infestations in the grain cellar. But the most unsettling indication of collapse came from inside. In January 1973, a boy named Nathan Feldman was recorded as removed from program due to physiological complications. This phrase appeared nowhere else in the school's documentation. According to an unredacted portion of a handwritten supply log, Nathan had been confined to Wing E for over 11 days following an incident of philosophical insubordination. There are no details of the incident. A subsequent notation lists without explanation: screamed during sleep, discontinued vocalization, persistent gaze. The final line, scrawled in different ink, reads, "Transport cancelled. He is still." His bunk remained made through spring. No outgoing file was generated. Despite mounting anomalies, the state's official position remained static. Internal memos continued to cite Black Forest as a necessary partner in the fight against moral delinquency. The phrase was repeated verbatim in 3 separate documents, suggesting template language issued from a higher administrative tier. That year, while other facilities were undergoing integration audits, Black Forest was specifically exempted under the spiritual isolation designation, a clause that had never been used before and has never appeared since. Families continued to write. They sent postcards, letters, even cassette tapes hoping to reach their sons. Some were returned with the stamp, "No such addressee." Others vanished. A few received typed replies informing them of the child's transitional relocation. No forwarding details. One mother, Clara Marsh, filed a lawsuit to compel the school to disclose her son's whereabouts. The case was dismissed for lack of standing. The court argued that Clara had ceded guardianship upon surrender. What was not disclosed was that her surrender document had been altered after signature, the second page replaced with one bearing typed clauses that granted the school indefinite custodial authority. There were no public announcements when the school ceased operations in August 1973. Staff were instructed to vacate within 4 days. Students were reclassified. This term was used in all closing documents, but no one could explain what it meant. No transfer logs were ever produced. When a county official arrived to secure the property 2 weeks later, he found the buildings empty, the files burned, and the underground Wing E padlocked from the outside with a rusted steel chain. The chain bore no brand or serial number. It was only in the decades that followed, as pieces were reassembled by survivors, archivists, and persistent relatives, that the depth of negligence became undeniable. Yet at the time there was nothing. No statement from the governor, no public inquiry. The silence was total. Even as nearby towns asked why buses no longer traveled the northern route, even as former staff quietly left the state, No one connected the figures. The children were gone, but they had been trained to vanish long before the gates ever closed. The first excavation began unofficially. In the fall of 1976, 3 years after the closure, a retired geologist named Dale Renshaw began mapping groundwater erosion patterns in the Black Forest region. His focus was academic, intended for a private soil stability project. During a drone survey funded through the state university, his team detected irregular depressions in the earth near the former Disciplinary school. These sinkholes were not consistent with natural patterns. They were symmetrical, equidistant, and shallow. Renshaw marked them for further study, unaware of what lay beneath. What followed was a slow unraveling. In January 1977, a regional grand jury reopened dormant files linked to state-run juvenile programs after mounting pressure from a coalition of families. A Freedom of Information petition had revealed multiple vanished cases marked resolved. One of the investigators assigned, Carla Vecchio, requested access to Black Forest grounds. She was granted limited entry. What she found was more preservation than decay. Despite 3 winters of abandonment, the structures remained sealed, windows intact, fences uncut. Someone had maintained the property after closure, though no ownership had been filed with the county. Vecchio focused on the chapel. The original building had collapsed partially during storms in 1974, but the octagonal annex remained. It was buried at an angle into the hillside. Its entrance was obscured by soil and vines. With assistance from local law enforcement, she gained access through a side hatch originally used for emergency egress. Inside, the air was dry. The floor was made of stamped earth, still bearing footprints. Along the northern wall was a wooden stand, roughly constructed, its surface stained with wax and something darker. Behind it, concealed behind a false panel, was a narrow passage. The corridor was barely shoulder-wide, descending in a slow spiral. It ended in a rectangular chamber with stone benches set into the walls. Here, Vecchio found 17 child-sized uniforms folded into precise stacks. Each bore a stitched patch, BFDS, and a numeric code. Several were crusted with age-darkened residue. At the center of the room was a metal pole anchored into concrete. Attached were 4 rusted loops, with lengths of frayed cord still threaded through them. Vecchio did not photograph the chamber. She later explained that her camera jammed repeatedly. She returned to the surface in silence and made her report. The district attorney's office initiated a forensic review, but within a week the directive was altered. No forensic team was dispatched. The report was rerouted to the Department of Youth Rehabilitation. There it disappeared. The same month, Dale Renshaw's erosion team began shallow test borings near the southern wall of the former administrative building. Just under 20 inches down, they struck layered textile. Assuming buried garbage, they unearthed a cache of student garments, all badly decomposed. Beneath the garments, they found bones. At first, animal, then smaller, human. The local coroner was summoned. Dental fragments, a jawline, a growth plate, all juvenile. The site was flagged and sealed. Publicly, there was no mention. Privately, the state began to reposition. Ownership of the land was transferred from the state trust to a private forestry concern under the name Reinhardt Holdings. All requests for access were henceforth denied. Renshaw's project lost its funding. His drone license was revoked after allegations of airspace violations. The families, when informed, were told that no conclusive evidence linked the remains to any specific student. The bones were stored at the Harrisburg Pathology Archive in Box F 1977. Their box remains unopened. Despite the silencing, evidence continued to surface. In spring 1978, an anonymous package arrived at the home of Stanley Dupre, a local journalist who had covered juvenile court affairs for the Williamsport Gazette. Inside were 4 pages torn from a ledger, each marked with the date and initials. The pages detailed punishments assigned to 13 students. The final column was labeled Finalization. Each listed one of 3 terms: reflected, returned, or retired. Only one student was marked returned. The others were retired. There was no explanation of terms. Dupre attempted to trace the sender. The return address belonged to a now demolished building once used by the Department of Religious Oversight. Dupré ran a short piece suggesting record tampering. The story received no traction. 2 weeks later, his editorial access was suspended. He took a leave of absence. In a private interview given years later, he said, "There was a cord running through that place. You tug on it even once and your whole life goes taut." The survivors remained elusive. Few were willing to speak. Those who did offered fragments, discordant and incomplete. One boy, housed in a halfway program in Scranton, described nights when alarms would sound and students would be forced outside barefoot to kneel on snow-packed ground. He claimed certain boys were called to recitation and never came back. When asked who conducted these sessions, he answered only, "The ones who didn't eat with us." Another, institutionalized in Pittsburgh, drew hundreds of variations of the same shape, a key with no teeth. In the margins of one sketchbook, he had written, "Only the voiceless were allowed to pass." Investigators attempted to cross-reference the surviving names with state census data. The matches were few. Most had no trail. School records had been scrubbed. Intake forms were missing or filled with generic identifiers. Photographs were non-existent. Only one yearbook was ever produced, for the year 1957. It contained only 10 portraits, all staged, all unnamed. In July 1979, a former custodian from Black Forest, terminally ill with lung disease, agreed to an interview. His name was Harold Ackerley. He had worked at the school for 9 years. When asked why he stayed so long, he replied, "I didn't have anywhere else to go." In his final week, he dictated a series of recollections. Among them, one stood out. "There was a room we weren't allowed near, not on cleaning days, not ever. They called it the archive. It was behind the pantry freezer. The door had no knob, just a slit for a card. Once I saw inside by mistake. Shelves, not books, not files, something else." The boys went in quiet, came out quiet, but their eyes had turned, like someone had opened the wrong window inside them. The archive was never found. The most damning artifact was never meant to be found. In September 1980, a volunteer with the Pennsylvania Historical Recovery Corps was combing the grounds near the disused maintenance shed at Black Forest's northeast boundary. The structure had long been overlooked, set apart from the dormitory units and buried partially beneath fallen timber. While removing debris, the volunteer's spade struck metal. Beneath 4 inches of soil, he unearthed a corroded tin box sealed with melted wax and twine. Inside were 28 index cards, each laminated, each marked with a name and a number. On the back of each card was a short phrase typed in block letters. The cards were catalogued but never made public. A photocopy set was delivered anonymously to the office of a civil litigation attorney in Pittsburgh, who released their contents 2 decades later under sealed deposition. The phrases were consistent. Non-responsive after retention. Refused confession protocol. Failed the stillness rubric. Not a single card bore a return date. Many of the names matched those on early court placement logs. One matched a boy whose mother had died searching for him. Another belonged to Jacob Denner, the student who returned from deep schooling with a hand injury and was never seen again. The number on his card was 077. Within weeks, the shed where the cards had been found was burned in what was labeled a lightning strike fire. The soil around it was salted and fenced. No further excavation was allowed on that part of the property. The recovery volunteer's name was never released. In the absence of bodies, the families fought for symbolic acknowledgement. In 1981, a petition was submitted to the State House demanding a formal hearing into the disappearances. The petition contained over 12,000 signatures. It was tabled, then marked inactive. Legislators cited jurisdictional ambiguity and the impossibility of retroactive harm validation. The language was deliberately obtuse. It created an echo chamber of procedural excuses. Within it, 191 names dissolved. But public pressure stirred deeper fears. In private, 2 state workers began compiling records they had been ordered to destroy. Their names were withheld for protection, but their archive, known as the Long Pine Ledger, was smuggled out and later formed the backbone of a civil lawsuit filed by 12 affected families. The ledger contained copies of transfer forms, internal correspondence, and partial student rosters. Among them was a one-page memorandum titled Discipline Spectrum Applications, dated 1965. It laid out categories for student handling: containable, conditional, extractable, final. Of the 54 students listed, 31 were marked final. There was no legal vocabulary for what had happened. No statute accounted for vanishment under state contract. The lawsuits advanced slowly, then stalled. Key witnesses fell ill or died. Files were misplaced. Attorneys recused themselves. Depositions vanished from archives. One family, after a year of legal motion, received a single page of resolution. This court finds insufficient evidence to demonstrate custody failure. The boy's name was printed incorrectly. Still, fragments surfaced. In 1983, a new road was proposed through the western edge of the Black Forest property. Survey crews discovered foundation remnants not listed on any map. The structure had no formal designation. Beneath a collapsed sub-basement were remnants of bedding, makeshift wiring, and a small rusted tin containing 3 broken pencils and a comb wrapped in thread. Etched into the concrete near the wall were 34 tally marks in groups of 5. The excavation was halted by order of the Department of Environmental Stewardship due to heritage preservation concerns. The site was reburied. Those who tried to document what had occurred faced slow attrition. In 1985, a documentary filmmaker from Chicago announced a project titled The Hollow School. After filming interviews with 3 survivors, her footage was seized during a traffic stop by state police, citing unauthorized biographic collection. No such statute existed. The footage was never returned. The filmmaker ceased all public work and later relocated abroad. Of the survivors who remained in the state, many were pulled back into institutional systems. Several were recommitted after acting out. Others succumbed to untreated health conditions, addiction or suicide. One survivor, age 43, was found wandering near the original school site in 1987, muttering unintelligibly and wearing a homemade uniform stitched with the initials BFDS. Authorities labeled him delusional. His fingerprints matched those of a child admitted in 1962 and listed as voluntarily discharged in 1966. He was returned to care. No interviews were permitted. The totality of evidence had formed, but never cohered. No single institution accepted responsibility. The Department of Education claimed lack of oversight jurisdiction. The Department of Human Services cited delegated contracts. Law enforcement deferred to expired statutes. In one memo between state legal counsel and a private arbitration firm, the case was described as the vanishing perimeter, an acknowledgement that every trace of wrongdoing was always located just beyond the next definable border. In 1989, a final anomaly emerged. During a remodeling project at a rural church 30 miles from the former school, workers found a locked wooden chest in the crawl space beneath the altar. The chest was nailed shut. Inside were ceremonial robes, a student ledger, and 23 black notebooks. Each notebook bore the initials of a different student. Each was filled with pages of copied scripture, but every verse had been slightly altered. Key words replaced with directional phrases. He shall rise became he shall report. The faithful are blessed became the compliant are returned. Entire psalms were rewritten to resemble institutional directives. A margin note in one notebook read, "Silence is the last key." The notebooks were quietly taken into diocesan custody. When later requested by archivists, the diocese claimed no record of the materials. The ledger from the chest listed student punishments by date and room assignment. One column titled Archive Status was filled for only some entries. The word used was always the same, sealed. The dates ended in 1972. The final name entered was Raymond Els. No arrests were made, no charges filed. But in the accumulation of details, weathered garments, redacted files, vanished recordings, sealed chests, the outline of a truth emerged. Not mystical, not mysterious. A design of silence. A system that never needed to hide because it had been allowed to vanish in plain sight. By the early 1990s, the physical remains of the Black Forest Disciplinary School had largely disappeared. Roofs had collapsed. Ivy strangled the chapel. The dormitory wing sank under its own rot. Nature consumed what bureaucracy had once held in place. Yet the silence endured. In the state's official records, the facility's closure is marked with a single line, "Ceased operation under contractual expiration." There is no appendix. No commentary. No list of unresolved names. In nearby towns, residents spoke of the school only when prompted. Older generations referred to it as a cautionary landmark, but not for the missing children. Instead, they spoke of jobs lost when it closed, of trucks that stopped arriving, of money that stopped flowing. Few remembered the faces of the boys. They had not shopped in stores. They had not attended local churches. They had left no artifacts behind. Their presence had always been designed to disappear. The families never received resolution. Instead, they inherited absence. Over time, even that absence was reshaped. Legal claims were reduced to settlements with no admission of fault. Memorials were proposed, then quietly withdrawn. One plaque was installed on a courthouse wall in 1992. It bore no names. Its inscription read, "In recognition of those whose paths remain unrecorded." The bronze dulled quickly. Visitors passed it without pause. Journalists who pursued the story encountered a form of resistance that was less obstruction than erosion. Phone lines went unanswered. Email inquiries bounced. Archivists referred requests to offices that no longer existed. When filings were made in person, clerks offered incorrect building addresses or returned hours later with empty hands, explaining that no such box has ever been stored here. The weight of documentation had become so fragmented, so deliberately disorganized, that no single thread remained intact. Those who tried to reassemble it were left with dead ends and file cabinets filled with duplicates, blanks, or fragments too brittle to handle. Among former students who survived, recollection came in flashes. The long corridor behind the kitchen, the whistle that signaled compliance drills, the slate board where names were erased instead of listed. One man, now in his 60s, could still recite the daily chant delivered each morning before labor assignments. It ended with the line, "Our correction is the world's order." When asked what that meant, he simply replied, "It meant we didn't matter." In 1994, a private foundation formed by 3 mothers attempted to create a registry of all children known to have entered Black Forest. They relied on birth certificates, foster placement logs, and court intake forms. After 2 years, their count reached 188. 3 years later, with help from volunteers, the number adjusted to 191. No 2 forms carried the same name list. The state declined to endorse the registry, citing statistical incongruities. The foundation disbanded in 1999. Its final newsletter read, "We were warned not to ask. We asked anyway." There were moments of rupture. In 2003, a construction team clearing a utility trench along the old Route 9 extension unearthed a hollow segment of reinforced tunnel. It was 6 feet high, 3 feet wide, and extended laterally beneath the former school boundary. No maps marked its existence. Within it, workers found rusted wheel tracks and a series of hooks bolted into the wall at shoulder height. A state historian arrived 2 days later. His report concluded that the tunnel was likely part of a Cold War civil defense effort. No further investigation was permitted. The tunnel was resealed with concrete and rerouted around. Efforts to archive the history met passive resistance. Libraries declined to catalog material without state authentication. Documentary footage could not be licensed for broadcast. Academic journals returned submissions unread. When one historian submitted a paper on the administrative vocabulary of institutional concealment, the feedback form read, "This reads like fiction. Consider reframing as creative non-fiction." The work was never published. For those closest to the truth, the weight of knowing often became corrosive. One former inspector, now retired, kept a locked chest in his attic labeled Site D. Inside were copies of inspection maps, 2 grainy photographs, and a cassette recording of an unmarked interview. The voice on the tape is childlike, quiet, sometimes unintelligible. At one point it says, "They took our birthdays." Another sentence, "We had to pray before forgetting." The tape ends with static. His daughter found the chest after his death. She offered its contents to the State Museum. They declined. The site itself is now overgrown. Only pieces remain. The cornerstones of the chapel, a rusted drainage grate, a ring of cement where the flagpole once stood. There is no signage, no fence. It is not listed on tourist maps. Hikers who pass through often remark on the sudden drop in sound. Birds fall silent. The air thickens. The forest narrows. They do not linger. Among state employees who worked in youth services during the period, most deny knowledge. A few admit remembering the name. Fewer remember the children. One mid-level administrator, interviewed anonymously in 2007, said, "It was always a black file. It wasn't our jurisdiction. It belonged to someone else, and that someone else had clearance." When asked if she believed anything criminal occurred, she paused, then said, "Not criminal, something else, something engineered. What remains is not memory, but distance." The Black Forest Disciplinary School has been pulled into the fabric of a country that thrives on procedural forgetfulness. It occupies no textbooks. It holds no days of recognition. Its silence is not absence but design, a discipline refined until it required no chains. Only doors that closed and did not reopen. Only ledgers with lines left blank. The soil still holds what the records do not. In 2011, a team of graduate students from a private university conducted an unsanctioned geophysical survey on the perimeter of the Black Forest site, using ground-penetrating radar under the guise of a climate project. What they found were anomalies, rows of equidistant voids, shallow depressions in formation. The data suggested repeated disruption of subsoil layers, consistent with historic burial activity. They submitted their findings to a regional historical review board. The submission was marked incomplete due to lack of landowner consent. The landowner, registered as a shell company based in Delaware, could not be contacted. Years passed. The site remained untouched, but its shadow grew longer, feeding online forums, local ghost stories, and speculative books. Most treated the school as myth, a place of vague fear. Few ventured beyond storytelling. Even fewer asked why no children from those years had grown up to speak freely. The ones who did surface showed patterns of institutional recycling, foster homes, correctional programs, psychiatric care. Their timelines were always disjointed, their records interrupted, as if their lives had been periodically erased and rewritten. In 2016, a Civil Liberties Foundation hosted a closed-door symposium on forgotten state facilities. A short segment was dedicated to Black Forest. Attendees received folders containing redacted intake forms and a 1971 expense report for moral realignment programming. The language in the report mirrored that of military counterinsurgency manuals. Phrases like extraction of threat vectors and reprogramming via exposure abstinence appeared beside inventory requests for cold storage units, sensory deprivation components, and concrete mix. None of the present officials would comment. One, after the event, left an anonymous voicemail with the Foundation's director. The voice said, "You're pulling at the edge of something that was never designed to be lifted. You think it was a school. It wasn't a school." That same year, a tree fell near the site during a lightning storm, revealing a long buried drainage canal. When cleared, it exposed rusted grates and a passage leading beneath the chapel's original floor. Urban explorers reached the chamber before authorities intervened. Footage later uploaded anonymously showed a cement room barren but for wall hooks and the imprint of shelving units. Graffiti had since marked the walls, but beneath it, scorched outlines of paper stacks were still visible. In the corner, a rusted bell. Not a school bell, a smaller one. Ritual-sized. Officials claimed the structure was unrelated. The entrance was sealed within a week. The footage vanished from public servers. In 2018, a man contacted a regional public radio station claiming to have been one of the monitors at Black Forest in its final year. He would not give his name. Over 6 recorded sessions, he described shifts that lasted 12 hours, a badge without his own name, and a list of students identified by only numbers. "We were told not to speak to them," he said. "We were told they were not ours." He recalled a schedule divided into waking drills, labor, memorization, and silence. The silence periods lasted up to 10 hours. He said that if a boy spoke during silence, he was removed. The removal was always final. The man paused when asked what that meant. He said, "Their names were deleted from the wall. We had to update the count. Down, always down." The recordings were never aired. The station was served with a cease and desist, citing state confidentiality protections for contracted custodial programs. The audio exists only in transcript. By 2020, even amateur investigations slowed. The story had been swallowed by the volume of modern crisis. New atrocities drowned old ones. New disappearances carried fresh horror. The Black Forest children became a footnote, their names unsearched, their histories unlinked. School databases showed no entries. Judicial records ended in discharge. Hospitals carried no intake logs. Cemeteries bore no stones. In a nation built on record, they were its most perfect erasure. Yet fragments remained. A maintenance log from 1972 found in a declassified box. A poem etched in pencil into the underside of a chapel bench. A prayer slip mailed without a return address, reading only, "We never broke. You made us forget, but not each other." It had been postmarked from 3 towns over. No DNA, no signature. In 2022, a memorial attempt was mounted again. A proposal for a commemorative installation on the grounds was submitted to the Clinton County Commission. The design was simple: 191 rusted silhouettes, each faceless, arranged in a spiral, names inscribed only if confirmed. The project was denied due to zoning restrictions. One commissioner privately admitted they feared what a monument might awaken. "You name them, you make it real," he said, "and if it becomes real, then we are asked what we did, and the answer is nothing." Now, the forest encroaches further. The wind threads through the stone remnants. The air stills near the perimeter. On rare occasions, hikers stumble upon cleared ground, moss pulled back as if something had stirred beneath. No wildlife nests there. No roots pierce it. The ground remembers in shape what the mind is trained to ignore. No official reckoning has occurred. The final report was never written. The state maintains that the children were runaways, that no pattern was ever proven. But the patterns remain visible to those who know how to read absence, in the lines left blank, in the families that stopped searching. In the silence preserved not by accident but by architecture, and in that silence the names persist. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget. But we insist on remembering